Wang Yibo stood stiffly in the center, the practiced aloofness of his industry persona a physical shield. He was accepting an award, his words concise, his gaze fixed somewhere safely above the assembled crowd. Then the camera swung, catching him in a periphery shot just as Xiao Zhan, seated 3 rows back, shifted in his seat. It was a movement of no consequence, the adjustment of a cuff, perhaps, but for those watching closely, who understood the language spoken only in shadows and reflections, it was the seismic shift that proved the ground beneath them was not solid. Yibo's speech paused, not for a beat, but for the microsecond it took for his eyes to involuntarily snap to that corner, a reflex utterly unscripted, utterly unguarded. The camera cut away too quickly for the moment to register as anything but a technical glitch, but the single, brief flash of raw recognition in Yibo's eyes, instantly masked and replaced by professional cool, was the evidence we needed, the opening chord to a symphony that had been playing in the deep, silent background since that summer of 2019. This was not the polite acknowledgement of a colleague, this was the sudden, desperate checking in of a person who carries another's well-being as his own vital sign. The memory of the accidental hand-hold thumbnail, that high contrast, nearly touching proximity, thrummed beneath the surface of this new event, confirming that the distance imposed by years and management contracts was nothing more than a flimsy scrim separating 2 souls who had, long ago, forgotten how to be separate. The intrigue was instantly intensified, because if that briefest of glances could hold the weight of years, what secrets were buried in the archives of their shared past, in the moments that broke the script entirely? The true story, the story that began to fracture the fiction, started not on the elaborate sets of cloud recesses, but in the echoing silence of a final rehearsal. They were filming the last emotional scenes, the parting, the sacrifice, the long, yearning look across the water, but the cameras were off. The crew was resetting lights, the tension of the impending farewell hanging heavy and thick like the morning mist they had become so accustomed to. Xiao Zhan, as Wei Wuxian, was supposed to be bright, perhaps a little playful, even in the face of tragedy, but in that moment of downtime, he looked utterly drained, the vibrant energy that defined his character pulled taut, ready to snap. Yibo, still wearing the severe, immaculate robes of Lan Wangji, walked over, not with the brisk, professional step of an actor but with the slow, measured tread of a devoted partner approaching a known point of pain. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a director's note or a shared joke. Instead, he simply extended his hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of offering comfort. Zhan, without lifting his gaze, reached out and placed his hand, cold and trembling, into Yibo's warm, steady grasp. This was the moment captured in the memory of the accidental hand-hold, but the reality was richer, more devastating. As their hands connected, Yibo's thumb moved, an almost invisible, minute stroke across Zhan's knuckles, a rhythm only 2 people could understand. It was the rhythm of a silent promise made months prior, during a grueling night shoot when Zhan had been ill. It was a purely personal, nonverbal affirmation, *I am here. I see you. You are not alone. The camera was still off. The director was distracted. The crew was preoccupied. But in that moment, the lines blurred so completely that the 2 men standing there were no longer actors. They were simply 2 souls tethered by a bond that superseded their roles, their contracts, and their entire industry. When the director finally called, "Action!" Zhan pulled his hand away, his expression immediately shifting back to Wuxian's weary smile. But the warmth of the contact lingered, a subtle, almost visible blush across his skin. Yibo, retreating to his mark, carried himself with a renewed, almost fierce determination, the protective watchfulness that was the core of Lan Wangji suddenly becoming a fundamental part of Wang Yibo. The emotional truth of the scene they were about to film was now irreversible. It was no longer performance, but documentation. The separation, when it came, was a deliberate, brutal cut enforced by the machinery of fame, yet it only served to amplify the hidden ties. The weight of a promise title resonated deeply here, echoing the fact that their hands, physically separated across continents and professional spheres, still found ways to touch. This was the era of the shared shadow. We tracked a specific piece of evidence, a simple, unbranded silver ring. During the show's run, both men were occasionally photographed wearing it, dismissed by the media as coincidence, or simply part of their personal styling. Yet, 6 months after the farewell fan meeting, when they were on 2 different continents promoting 2 entirely different projects, a curious pattern emerged. Ibo, performing an aggressively energetic dance routine in China, wore the ring on his left index finger, visible only when his hands whipped into a specific, high-velocity choreographic stance. Simultaneously, Zhan, attending a formal red carpet event in Paris, wore the exact same ring, but not on his finger. It was strung onto a simple, thin black cord and tucked beneath his crisp white shirt, a hidden pendant resting against his sternum, directly over his heart. This wasn't a coincidence of styling, it was a deliberate, synchronized declaration of belonging, hidden in plain sight. This small, secret sign was their anchor, their silent broadcast to each other across the impossible distance. The profound weight of this shared jewelry, worn differently yet carrying the same intent, confirmed the theory. Their connection wasn't a phase or a work relationship, but a deliberate, maintained spiritual partnership. They were communicating through objects and placement, telling a story that the public was blind to, confirming that the promise they had sealed with that silent hand stroke backstage was a promise of forever, rehearsed only by destiny itself. The moments that truly broke the script and revealed the whispers of forever were found in the public arenas, years after the initial phenomenon had cooled into sustained stardom. They were invited, separately, to the same high-profile New Year's gala. The security was immense, the seating arrangements meticulously planned to keep them apart, perhaps 50 feet separating their respective tables. But watch the broadcast carefully, and you'll see the silence between the lines, the decoding of their unspoken language. As a highly respected senior actor approached Wang Yibo's table for a polite conversation, Yibo gave a short, specific nod, almost imperceptible. This nod, however, was not directed at the senior actor, it was a cue. Seconds later, across the cavernous room, Xiao Zhan, who was engaged in a deep conversation with his own director, subtly pressed the tip of his left index finger to his temple. The gesture was instantaneous, a flash of signal response. Understood. Later, when Yibo was being interviewed on the red carpet, the reporter asked him a generic question about his 2024 plans. Yibo gave a professional, evasive answer, but as he spoke the word commitment, he used his left hand to brush a non-existent piece of lint from his lapel, his hand settling exactly over the breast pocket. The air in the warehouse was cold, but the point where Wang Yibo's hand rested over Xiao Zhan's, sealing the confession on his chest, radiated a profound, agonizing heat. That shared truth, that their story was simply life, was a flame, beautiful and consuming, but it was also a vulnerability too precious and too dangerous to be exposed. The moment was not an end, it was the quiet, terrifying beginning of a clandestine war against the world. They pulled apart, not from a lack of desire to stay, but from the crushing weight of their professional reality. They understood, instantly and completely, that every shared breath from that moment forward would be an act of defiance. The price of this sacred, unscripted bond was not a simple distance, it was the deliberate performance of strangers. The first cost was the weight of the mask. They had to become the industry's perfect solo artists, their success a fortress built entirely on fabricated isolation. Xiao Zhan, the warm, smiling star, learned to calibrate his joy, ensuring no spark in his eyes was too bright, no laugh too free, lest it betray the source of his genuine light. He became a master of the generalized gaze, looking everywhere and at everyone, except the one person he truly saw. Wang Yibo, already a connoisseur of cool detachment, deepened his shield of aloofness into an impenetrable wall of ice. His famed intensity, which once softened only for Xiao Zhan, now became a generalized professional armor, so convincing that the world believed he had simply shed the vulnerability of his youth. The cameras recorded a steady, upward trajectory for both, but the unseen tax was the erasure of their shared language. They had to unlearn the reflexes, the immediate turn towards each other's voice, the synchronized tilt of the head, the unspoken humor that once flashed between them on every stage. They had to rehearse awkwardness, forcing their bodies to betray the natural magnetism that pulled them together. The deepest wound was inflicted during the major public events where separation was impossible. We documented the brief, shared glances at the gala, but the true agony lay in the rehearsed non-interaction. At one award ceremony, they were seated mere tables apart. The event was a cacophony of music, applause, and flashing lights, yet for them, it was a silence more deafening than any void. Xiao Zhan, catching a split-second reflection of Iba in a dark marble column across the room, felt a physical ache in his right hand, the hand that had held Iba's in the quiet backstage years ago. He wanted desperately to send a sign, a confirmation that the soul inside the pristine black suit was still his. He subtly adjusted his necklace, the chain briefly touching his throat, a tiny, almost subliminal movement. Iba, accepting an award minutes later, was stoic, but as he turned to leave the stage, his fingers moved, brushing the knot of his necktie, the identical, reciprocal gesture confirming the signal was received. This wasn't a sweet coincidence. It was a necessary lifeboat of communication tossed across an ocean of manufactured distance. The price they paid for this tiny act of connection was the entirety of their visible joy. Every subsequent interview, every public appearance, was shadowed by the knowledge that the greatest performance of their careers was pretending their shared history was nothing but a memory. They paid for the survival of their truth with the death of their public warmth. The emotional climax of this sacrifice came when their individual fans, unaware of the profound, fragile reality of their bond, turned their speculation into a weapon. The fandom wars, the controversies, the manufactured crises, all served to solidify the industry's mandate for permanent separation. This was the cost of visibility. They realized that the only way to save the connection was to sacrifice the company. They had to let the world believe the fiction, that the friendship was a thing of the past, a casualty of success, or worse, a genuine rivalry. They willingly became the most famous strangers in the industry, their proximity at events becoming a source of intense stress rather than solace. The weight of this public lie began to affect their work. There were moments on separate sets, years apart, when a director would call for a scene demanding profound emotional vulnerability or quiet devotion. In those moments, both men would unknowingly resort to the archetypes they created together: Wan Yibo's Han Wangji's gaze of protective stillness, Xiao Zhan's Wei Wuxian's smile of self-sacrificing acceptance. They were, in essence, acting out their real-life sacrifice through the guise of their new roles, the separation from each other serving as their raw, emotional core. Their characters were thriving, but the cost was the quiet, private grief of the two men who had to live their devotion in coded silence. Their bond didn't just survive this separation, it evolved. It moved beyond simple friendship or even romance and settled into something truly unique: absolute mutual protection. Every career move, every endorsement, every public statement, was vetted not just by their teams, but by their own subconscious filter. Will this put him at risk? Their success became less about personal ambition and more about building unassailable professional stature so that one day, the fortress they built of separate careers could finally protect their single, unified truth. The single, shared silver ring, worn either over the heart or on the index finger, was no longer just an anchor. It was a talisman of quiet endurance, a daily reminder of the promise that survived the censorship, the fame, and the manufactured hate. The price they paid was the constant burden of perfection, the need to be so faultless, so professionally pristine, that the world would never have grounds to tear down the truth they were so meticulously guarding. This is the hidden chapter, the untold sacrifice that gave meaning to every glance and every coded touch. It wasn't the cameras, the fans, or the contracts that defined them. It was the strength of the bond forged in the fires of fame, a bond they chose to save at the expense of their public relationship. Now you know the full weight of their unscripted reality. The next question isn't if their story is real, but what their future holds, the elusive, whispered theory of their ultimate reunion.